Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. The UN Human Rights Council has just been presented with a new report detailing widespread war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria. And while many of the listed atrocities seem to be deliberate in nature, the report also states that the most civilian deaths resulted from indiscriminate shelling by both sides. Isn't the war itself the biggest crime perpetrated against the Syrian people? And if so, who should shoulder the blame? Well, to discuss it, I'm now joined by Vitit Muntarbhorn, a member of the UN Independent Commission that led this inquiry. I really appreciate your time, sir. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this is the 10th report that your commission issued on Syria, and reading them is becoming increasingly more difficult. The footage and the testimonies of the atrocities are getting more and more brutal by the month. But without wishing to sound callous, I wonder if it's something to be expected when the world, it seems, is still bent on continuing with this war. This war is still being fueled from the outside.
The report that just came out is the 11th report of the Commission Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic. The mandate of the Commission covers violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. That's warfare and the rules of conduct in warfare, particularly covering the plight of civilians. And that's what we aim for very much in terms of centrality of coverage, with a view to identifying those responsible in terms of accountability. Sadly, the situation is still, it's a very devastating situation. The killings, the torture.
Mr. Muntarbhorn, sorry for jumping in, but I wonder, yes, you just mentioned that the situation is getting increasingly more desperate and increasingly more dangerous, but I wonder if it could have been different, really, because what would be an alternative to committing war crimes in a war zone? The only alternative I can think of would be not having this war at all. So I would like to ask you, could you cite any specific example, maybe from the recent history, of a war conducted in a good way, in accordance with the laws of war?
I think the whole point of what we call humanitarian law is to have some rules of conduct that benefit everyone, including the fighters, and of course particularly the civilians. So principles and rules such as we must distinguish between military objects, military personnel, and civilians, and so we shouldn't shoot civilian personnel and objects while, of course, the conduct between the military continues. That principle of principle against discriminate attacks or indiscriminate attacks that happen, which are complained against and castigated by us. That's a very important principle. Another one is the prohibition on various weapons, use of various weapons. Very recently, of course, the issue of chemical weapons, but other weapons such as cluster bombs, for example, or in the situation that we've covered, barrel bombs that drop from helicopters or whatever and affect very much civilians in terms of this indiscriminate attack on civilians.
I think you just laid out some of your major criticisms against the Syrian government, that would be launching indiscriminate attacks against civilians, something that you mentioned in this report and in many of the previous reports. But you also make a point in this report that rebel forces themselves often operate from within civilian neighborhoods, therefore putting civilians at risk. And I think we all would agree with your recommendation that the Syrian government should do a much better job distinguishing between civilians and combatants. I wonder if the Commission can offer a specific advice on how to do that at a time of a civil war.
The coverage that we offer encompasses all groups, both government and non-government. And the humanitarian message that is relayed is one that's relayed to all sides. So that's the non-discriminatory aspect of our work in terms of covering all actors inside Syria, as well as a message for those backing them. And the current report, which is the 11th report, offers a sad litany of violations by government groups, government forces, and it also covers the acts, the misdeeds of non-government armed groups. And I give you one example, the issue of child soldiers, for example, we raised very prominently and openly in regard to the conduct of non-government armed groups in terms of usage of children as soldiers.
Mr.
Likewise,
Muntarbhorn,
there are
many more crimes committed by the rebels that you list, but let me press you a little bit on that, because I think this is a crucial point. The Syrian government, as well as the Syrian rebels, have been criticized for the atrocities, but again, I come back to my original point, is whether you can really act differently in a situation of a civil war. And more specifically, since most of the deaths come from shelling, I wonder if indeed the Syrian government could have chosen a different way, different option of conducting that war, and what that option would be from a humanitarian point of view.
Well, one angle is prevention. And prevention demands a certain order, a certain policy from governments and non-government armed groups to abide by the law. So the order from the top must be very clear to prevent violations. Another angle is protection of particularly civilians, and that means a respect for their rights and accountability. And all that is very much linked also not only with our work, but the UN system as a whole in terms of enabling a certain system of accountability to take place.
Now, you mentioned earlier the prevention aspect, that the best, I guess, what I took from your answer, the best way would be to focus on conflict prevention rather than resolution. But what struck me in the report that you just issued was that you criticized, again, the Assad government for the heavy use of military force, including missiles, fighter jets and artillery, against rebel-held areas to, quote, prevent a return to normality under armed group control. And I wonder, what would be the example of normality under armed group control? Is it actually saying that once a rebel group takes control of a certain territory, the government should just lay down their arms and let them administer that neighborhood in whatever way they please?
Well, we have basic principles on this, particularly emerging from the Geneva Conventions concerning warfare, armed conflicts, and particularly Article 3, which pertains to non-international armed conflicts or civil war. Even in times of civil war, there are certain premises, there are certain principles that should be followed. For example, if someone is detained, he or she should be taken to a regularly constituted court or tribunal and should not be summarily executed.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I agree with you on that point. But my question was a bit different. My question was about what you call normality under armed group control. And we had just a couple of months ago the example of the city of Raqqa, which was administered by Al-Qaeda-associated groups with Sharia trials and people being publicly executed on the streets. And you are criticizing the Syrian government for shelling those neighborhoods in its efforts to get them rid of the rebels. But I wonder if your criticism is really valid. Is the city administered by Al-Qaeda the example of normality that you allude to in your report?
The elements, if we want to use the word normality, I would link that very much with applying, implementing humanitarian rules, humanitarian law, even in times of armed conflict in all territories occupied by whomever. For example, as I said earlier, whoever is detained in any territory in an armed conflict should have access to a regularly constituted court and should not be executed summarily. Another issue is humanitarian access to food, water, education, medical supplies. Very important to enable that to take place, even in time of war, in whatever territories, whether it's government-controlled or in opposition-controlled areas.
If those rights that you just mentioned are denied by rebel groups, does the government, not only the Syrian government, but any other government, have the right to use force to eliminate those rebel groups from the area?
Principle is this: if there's a crime committed, one crime does not justify another crime. Secondly, whoever is responsible for misdeeds should fall under the general international law, human rights, humanitarian law, and there are basic principles that I've already listed. For example, if you catch someone for a certain misdeed, even in time of war, that person should not be executed summarily, but should be taken to a regularly constituted court. Another principle is that everyone should have access to humanitarian assistance, particularly medical assistance, and that medical medical personnel in any territory should be protected together with the medical facilities and access to medical care. So all these pertain very much to Syria today, as well as any other situation of armed conflict.
Okay, we talked a little bit about the violations committed by the Syrian government. I think what makes this report is a little bit different from the previous ones is that you note an upsurge in atrocities committed by the rebels, and more specifically, you mentioned that there is an increasing influx of foreign fighters into Syria. And the Syrian government, of course, has been claiming that for more than 2 years. They've been even providing documented evidence of that, but a significant part of the international community was dismissing those evidence as essentially the Syrian regime propaganda to justify its crimes against humanity. Now it looks that the commission that you represent also finds some truth in the claims of the Syrian regime that this is not just war, not just a civil war, but also a war against terrorism.
The international position, and certainly our position, is that this is a non-international armed conflict, a civil war in colloquial terms, and it falls under what we call humanitarian law, particularly law concerning the war, Geneva Conventions 1949, together with protocols of 1977. The issue of labeling acts or labeling misdeeds, we do have many terms that are being used, and you cited some of them. Now, one very important principle in time of war is that acts of terror, acts spreading terror among the civilian population are prohibited. So those acts, such as bombing intentionally civilian population to create terror, those would be classifiable as war crimes. And we do cover these situations, acts spreading terror among the civilian population.
Okay, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, as the world once again fails on conflict resolution, shouldn't the international community focus more on conflict prevention? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the latest report on atrocities in Syria with Vitit Muntarbhorn, a member of the independent commission that led that inquiry. Before we went to break, we were talking about accountability and the standards of war, the laws of war that should ideally speaking, apply to everybody. And in your latest report, the Commission accuses the government of using torture against the detainees, including what it calls previously undocumented torture methods. For example, it cites the so-called simulated drowning, which to me sounds very similar to a practice, American practice of waterboarding. And I think we all would agree, the United Nations certainly agreed that the treatment of detainees in Iraq constituted torture, the treatment of detainees in Guantanamo constituted torture. There are also numerous reports of torture in the Libyan prisons. I guess the question I'm asking is, do you get a sense that torture is essentially becoming trivialized in war zones these days? Because we can talk about accountability of the Assad government for the crimes against humanity that it committed, but obviously, admittedly, the Assad government's record on human rights has never been particularly strong, whereas certain countries like the United States, for example, that is considered a champion of democracy and human rights, has committed torture on record and yet has never been brought to account for that.
Well, as you know, our mandate, the Commission of Inquiry, covers what happens in Syria. So I'm not in a position to make comparisons with situations elsewhere. And in that perspective, of course, torture is a universal crime. It's an international crime. And in the context of what we're dealing with, torture is also a war crime and a crime against humanity if it's particularly practiced systematically or in a widespread manner against the civilian population. So all these are possibilities in terms of responsibility, in terms of criminal responsibility and accountability. What is interesting with the situation concerning Syria is that Syria is not a member, not a party to the statute of the International Criminal Court.
Neither is the United States, by the way.
Well, I'm not talking about any other countries. I'm talking about the remit, the mandate that I'm covering, with due respect to the various comments. I'm talking about Syria, and Syria is not a party to the International Criminal Court's statute. So in that position, so to speak, nationals from Syria cannot be cross-referred to the International Criminal Court through lack of that ratification. However, we do have a means of referring, whether it's Syrians or anybody else who commit major violations, to the International Criminal Court, and that is through the auspices of the Security Council. So one of the measures that could be taken up is through the Security Council to cross-refer cases to the International Criminal Court.
Now, as we speak about the use of torture or other crimes against humanity committed in Syria, I'm sure you are aware that from the very beginning of this conflict, it has been marked by unprecedented efforts to manipulate public opinion, both within Syria and outside Syria, by the government as well as by rebel groups. And I think the accounts of atrocities, not only in this conflict, but also in previous conflicts, the Libyan conflict would be one example of that, have been used to put pressure on the international community to prompt some sort of action, even though, for example, in the Libyan case, many of those claims of atrocities were never substantiated. My question to you is how cognizant you are that anything that you say, anything that you put in your report can influence how this war is going to develop in the future. Any given party may use that report to justify its own course of action.
We're totally conscious of the responsibility to be fair and impartial. And you may or may not know that the commissioners are pro bono. We're doing this free to help the international community and, of course, particularly the Syrian people. And it's an honor and pleasure to do so. So that's a spirit with which we come in terms of objectivity, impartiality, and total commitment.
Absolutely, but I think the methods that you are using cannot be described as very reliable. As far as I understand, you rely primarily on interviews, phone interviews, Skype interviews, personal interviews. And as a war correspondent myself, I know that at the time of war, and in any war zone, the stories of atrocities take on life of their own, and it's only natural for people to seek to justify the side that they support and demonize the side that they oppose. And I think, again, the Libyan example shows that many of the claims of atrocities that people are so sure about during the war turn out to be unsubstantiated later on.
What we do is we have investigators who interview witnesses and victims directly. Over 2,000 people have been interviewed already. Very substantial documentation as to who did what, who suffered, when things took place. And through that evidence, we cross-check what we call corroboration. And after that, we synthesize our findings so as to ultimately have a list of those close to the circumstances or the list of perpetrators. So I think that's a very, very balanced approach, bearing in mind that we also welcome the possibility of entering Syria. We've asked for entry, but we're still waiting for a response in terms of entry. And if we are able to enter with our investigators, that will help us much more in terms of direct access to the evidence at the local level. But even today, we have some access through Skype to those in Syria. But the methodology that I highlighted earlier is one that assesses and listens to the evidence, the witnesses who might be outside Syria, but they are direct witnesses who are checked, cross-checked, and corroborated.
Mr. Muntarbhorn, I think there have been some examples in the past when the international community, including your own commission, was absolutely sure about who conducted any given atrocity. For example, the Hula massacre back in May 2012. The report by your commission put the blame squarely on the Assad government. Later on, it emerged that, for example, I believe it was the UN Human Rights Council that published the report saying that with evidence available, it wasn't possible to conclude who actually did that massacre. And there are still a lot of questions and unanswered questions about who may have been behind that massacre. I guess my question is whether or not, in all your investigations, in your experience, you have ever come up either against evidence or at least a suspicion that some of those massacres may be perpetrated by people who try to put the blame on the other side.
Well, the Al Hula situation took place a while ago, and so I would invite you to particularly look at the updates and the more recent reports, which look at other situations. The current report, the 11th report, actually lists 8 massacres in our annex, 8 massacres perpetrated by government forces and 1 massacre perpetrated by non-government forces. So that's in the current report.
I'm sorry for going for that question once again, but I think the Hula massacre is a very interesting example, because back then I remember how the entire international community was, well, with some exceptions, notable exceptions, of course, but was rallying behind that massacre and really trying to push that as a reason to authorize international intervention in Syria. Now, of course, the world's attention is turned to the suburb of Damascus, where chemical weapons were supposedly used. And, you know, some part of the international community is once again absolutely positive about who did that attack. But again, the suspicions remain.
Well, I think the first message, particularly because you link that situation to many other elements, the first message that we've consistently highlighted is that there is no military solution. There is no military solution. It has to be a political solution, a peaceful solution. Secondly, we are in the role of fact-finding. In other words, looking at the facts and circumstances, including Al Hula. But since then, there have been many other situations. The current report looks at Al-Qasir, which was a request put to us just a few months ago, as well as many other massacres and unlawful killings and so on. So this is the progression of the analysis with a view to accountability. And thirdly, I think it's very important that we relay the message that the actors, the perpetrators, may have some backers, what we call constituencies, behind them. And so our message also is to invite and influence the constituencies behind the various groups and troops and so on to abide by human rights and humanitarian law, as well as to ensure that the people they give arms or money to comply with human rights and humanitarian law. Well, ensuring compliance.
What you just said is a crucial piece of the puzzle here, of course, and I would like, I mean, the continuing support for the for various parties in this conflict, and making sure that proxy parties, proxy powers also comply with the recommendations that you suggest. But coming back to what you just said, and I think it's included in the report that there is no military solution to this conflict. Obviously, you, in the context of your report, it is more or less related to the Syrian government and the fact that it has to rein in its military offensive. But if there is no military solution in principle, shouldn't we also recognize that there should be no military solution as applied to the rebels? Because it was the rebel forces who actually saw the military solution as a way of advancing their political goals. They preferred the military solution from the very beginning. They continue on the path of their resistance as a way of advancing their probably most legitimate goals. And moreover, the United States, one of the proxy parties to this conflict, was talking about a military intervention just last week. So if there is no military solution there should be no military solution for the Assad government, shouldn't that also apply to the rebels and to the outside forces?
I think you've used some words that I wouldn't use. The words that I would use would be no military solution, and that we would go towards a political settlement, political solution.
But shouldn't that
bearing in
apply
mind that
to
all
all
sides. Yes, that's a message for everyone, and we welcome very much media in support of this message in terms of the need for a political solution. Having said that, again, I think a couple of words might be useful to you from the speech that the chair delivered today in the Human Rights Council in Geneva. We use the word influential states. Influential states should also help us on this in terms of relaying the message of human rights and humanitarian law, as well as to help ensure compliance with the principles concerned, such as the need to distinguish between military targets and non-military targets. So protection of civilians is key, and non-use of certain weapons, weapons that we classify as illegals, as well as conduct of hostilities in compliance with humanitarian.
And Mr. Muntarbhorn, if I could, I would add only one option to that list that you just mentioned, and that is thinking twice before encouraging military rebellion or uprising for whatever democratic cause there may be. But unfortunately, we are out of time. We have to leave it there. I really appreciate you talking to us. And I would like to leave our viewers with a quote from Robert Jackson, the chief U.S. prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, who said that war itself was a major precursor for future atrocities, and resorting to it was the biggest crime of all. But this is all we have time for, so please join us again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.